All right. So today we'll be getting started with um, web development in Python. But before we start, as we'll be going through the process of setting up our development environment, installing Python, installing our version control software, and creating a GitHub account, so that everything we do, we can easily, so that everything we do is backed up easily in a source code repository that we can clone off another system at a later date. All right, so the first thing I'm going to do is we'll need to install Python on our system. I already have Python on this system, but just in case we don't have it, just Google Python download. And in this class, we'll be focusing on Python 3. So as much as possible, you want to get Python 3.6 to download. Also, we would be we would need the Git setup for Windows. As in, Git is a version control software. It's used in easily working, as in getting multiple people to be able to work on the same project. So we need to download Git for Windows. I already have to my system, but just in case you need the link, here's how you can get it. All right. Then finally, you can use any text editor of your choice, but in this class, I'm making use of Visual Studio Code. Visual Studio Code. So the reason why for this text editor is it has a lot of plugins that make it very easy to work with Python and other languages. And you can just choose to download it. All right. Now, assuming you've gotten everything set up, and we should have a window like, okay, so assuming you got everything set up, you will need to open Git Bash. So by default, this is your root, your home directory. You can use the pwd command to find out about your current directory. And anytime you want to come to the current directory, cd the tilde symbol. It always takes you from wherever you are to your current directory. Also, you will need to create a folder where you are going to keep all your projects. Now, you can choose to create a folder anywhere in your laptop. In my own case, I choose to create my folder in the documents. I choose to create my project folder in the documents directory. So to change directory, cd documents, you use the tab key to autocomplete. And if I want to list the list of directories, I use ls stack la and I list all the directories in that particular folder. So you can see the projects folder. So I'm navigating this folder. So it is in this project folder that I have all the list of all my projects, all my programming related projects. So in this case, we're going to create a new project, a sample project. And we're going to set up Git and connect us and to be able to deploy that particular project to GitHub or any other version control, version control system available. All right, so I'm going to change directory to training. In your case, you might not have the training directory, but my project directory in this case is document/project/training. In your case, you might have to create a project directory in your documents folder. You can either create it manually on Windows or you can create a folder directly from the command line. And to create a folder from the command line, you use the mkdir command. So mkdir, let me call this Learning Flask. So that is the name of my project. So if I type ls stack la, we should see the Learning Flask folder there. So I'm going to change Learning Flask. And from this directory, I want to open my text editor from this current folder. So code dot, where dot means the current directory, as in this particular directory that I'm navigating to. And my text editor should come up. And you can see we're currently in the Learning Flags folder. So instead of alternating between my terminal and my text editor, Visual Studio Code comes with an inbuilt text editor. So I use Control backtick And you can see the text editor here looks almost similar with the text editor for Git Bash. That is because Visual Studio supports choosing different terminals. In your case, you might see a prompt asking you to choose the shell, your integrated your shell or terminal. In that case, ensure that you choose Git Bash. All right. So right now our project is currently empty. Let's create a file. Can click on the icon here and let me call this hello.py. Print hello. So I just created a simple file. Of course, this file is not so much useful. But because what we are trying to do now is to get our project to version control, we need to initialize you need to ensure that our project, as a Git, knows about our project. And the first thing we need to do is to initialize Git on this project. And to do that, assuming you've installed Git init. By running this command, you will see that this particular icon on Visual Studio Code shows a notification. And how do you know that Git is installed on your project? You know that by running ls stack la, and you should see a .git folder on your system. So right now, our project has been initialized by Git. Now, there are two ways we can use Git. You either use Git on the command line, or you use Git from the UI interface that Visual Studio provides for us. Okay, so there are different states of it. When working with Git, there are different states of all the files Git tracked. By default, once a project has been initialized with Git knows about all the files, but Git is not tracking any one of them. So what that means is anytime you see the U grade icon, it means the file is being untracked by Git. Alternatively, you could use Git status on the command line. So let me zoom out the screen. You could use Git status on the command line to see all the untracked files that Git knows about. And you can see here that Git is successfully tracking. Git knows about the hello.py file, but is not tracking it yet. Now, to get Git to track a file, you run git add the name of the file if you're using the command line, or you just click on the plus icon here. They do the same thing. So with that, the status changes from U to A. So now Git knows about the file. Git knows about the file and is now tracking it. But if I make a change to this file, for whatsoever reason, now you can see the file ended up changing from A to M. And that is because some changes have been made to that particular file. So at every point in time, we want the state of our file to always be, especially after we made changes, we want it to always be at A. So we need to run git add. You can see I'm using dot here. Dot means the current directory. But if I want to specify the file exactly, I can choose to specify the file directly, and changes our edits are being staged. Now, once we are done with our edit, we need to commit. We need to commit our changes to Git. And to do that, we need to put a commit message explaining all the changes that we've done. You can either choose to put the commit message here, or from the command line, you run git commit stack m. Then we'll put the message in either single quotes or double quotes. So in this case, what did I do? I created a sample Python file. And with this, you can see now that all our changes have been committed to Git. As in everything is being committed to Git. So what is remaining now is to either push our project to an online source code repository. But before we do that, I want to explain how we can avoid adding unnecessary files to our Git repository. Now, take for instance, we currently have an hello.py, and assuming we add another file or another folder known as hello.txt. Now you can see by default, Git is he already knows about that file. But if we don't want Git to even track the hello.txt at all, or as in Git should assume that the hello.txt file or any other .txt file, we don't want to add any .txt file to our project. As in Git should completely ignore all the .txt files. We need to find a way to tell Git to ignore all .txt files. And to do that, Git uses a special file known as the .gitignore. So create a new file known as .gitignore. And in this .gitignore file, we specify what we want to, as in the files we want to exclude. So you can see immediately I put this .txt file. If we come back to our Git tracker, the only thing is tracking now is the .gitignore file, because the .gitignore file is still actually a file. But all the .txt files, they are no longer tracked. That is because Git knows how to read information from the gitignore file. So we need to add and commit our gitignore file. I will just use this to add it, and I'll just write a commit message. Added a gitignore file. And once I've done that, just click on the commit check mark there, and I've committed all the changes. Now, the next step is to deploy our code to Git. But before we do that, since we are using the Git bash shell, we need to ensure that we have our SSH keys, because our SSH keys is how we can easily connect our remote version control system with our local version control system easily. So I'm going to switch to a new tab, and I'm going to go to my home directory. Remember, I said to go to the home directory, cd tilde, and we are back in the home directory. So we need to check if we currently have any current SSH keys. And to do that, we use ls-la. But we know ls-la will list a lot of files, as in the files are way too much in my system. So I want to limit it to, I'm looking for a particular folder that starts with .ssh. So that is going to be ls-la. And I'm going to use the pipe symbol, grep.ssh. So because .ssh is the name of the folder I'm looking for. If I'm looking for another folder, I just specify the folder after the grep. So you can see I currently have a .ssh folder. If I change directory to the .ssh folder and I run ls, I have my own private and public key. But in your case, you might not have that. So we're going to end up creating it from scratch. To create a SSH key, we make use of the SSH keygen command. So it's asking to generate private and public keys. Because I already have an ID_RSA, I'm going to give my own a special name. But in your own case, you might just choose to leave the name leave the name as it is by pressing the enter key. So in my own case, I'm going to call it sample. I'm going to call it sample. Ensure that you don't set any password in this paraphrase part, so that you don't keep, as in anytime you connect to Git, it doesn't ask you for password every single time. So empty, and now it has created the SSH keys. So if I change directory to the .ssh and I type ls, in your case, you should see the ID_RSA and the ID_RSA.pub key. But in my own case, the SSH key that I created was in this directory because I did not specify a path. So if I type grep sample, so you can see in my case, it created the sample and the sample.pub key on my root directory. And that was because I had to specify the key manually, because I already had an SSH key before. But in your case, the SSH key should exist in the .ssh folder. So now the next step is to create a GitHub account. So we'll go to github.com. If you don't have a GitHub account, you sign up and create one. So after doing that, we need to create a new repository. But before we create a new repository, we need to ensure that Git knows about our SSH keys. So from the profile, we go down to the settings. we find the SSH and GPG keys. Then we add new SSH keys. So I'm going to call this second SSH key. And in this place, we would have to copy the SSH key that we just created. In my own case, my own is sample.pub, but in your own case, it's going to be id_rsa.pub. So assuming I wanted to copy the public key for id_rsa, I'm going to print it out on the screen by running cat.ssh id_rsa.pub, and I end up copying out these keys. Then after copying it, I come to the text editor and I paste it exactly the way it is. Don't edit any line. Paste it exactly the way it is. And you click add SSH keys to ask you to confirm your password. After confirming your password, in my own case, because the key already exists, it didn't allow me to add it again. But in your case, it should successfully add. And with that, Git now knows about our SSH keys. So the next step is to create our repository. And to do that, we come to the icon beside our profile and we'll click on new repository. I choose to give it any name we like. I'm going to create this in a different folder. I'm going to call this Learning Flask. I'm not going to give it any this thing, and I'm just going to create the project like that. All right, so now we know that we're using SSH to connect. We're not using HTTPS. So this is, and we have an existing project. So we have to go to our existing project and literally copy out this command the way they pasted it for us. So I'm just going to click on copy. I'm going to go to my terminal, go back to the first shell. Then I'm going to paste the command. So the first command was git remove at the git URL, and the second command was git push -q origin master. And with that, I should be able to push my changes successfully to Git. But in your own case, because you just created Git, you're just installing Git for the first time, you might see some prompt coming up, like as in you need to, or when you want to commit a message, for several reasons, you might see some prompt saying you need to add a username and a password. One very interesting thing that happens with Git is if you type a wrong command, to a large extent, Git will tell you what you needed to do, or what it thought you wanted to do. So when you run into a problem with Git, most of the time the solution is right from the message that Git shows you. So we successfully pushed our code to GitHub, and if we come back to GitHub, refresh our repo, we should see that it's correctly detecting our file. It's currently detecting our file. Okay, so that is the crash course on Git. The main commands on Git are git init to set up a repository, git add to start tracking a file, git commit to save all the changes that have been done to a particular Git repository, and git push to push the project back to the remote server. Git remote is used to connect a local repository to a remote repository. To find out more about GitHub commands, so you can just Google Git cheat sheet, and you have it, and you have all the commands, especially in the PDF file, all the commands that you need to know about Git at your fingertips. So that's that. Now, that is all about Git. We'll use more commands with Git as we progress in the project. So now we want to begin with our first application. I'm assuming we've installed Python on our system. Okay, so I currently have Python 2, but we should be using Python 3. Okay, I also have Python 3, so that's good. So the next step is we need to install we need to install a package in Python that helps us to be able to set up virtual environments. And to do that, we're going to use a pip command. And so pip3 or pip, if you already have one single Python installation in your system, pip3 install virtual env. Look at the spelling virtual env. I think I currently have it installed, so we're good to go. Then we need to use virtual env to create a virtual environment for this particular project. Now, a virtual environment is, you could think of a virtual environment as a mini Python installation for just the project you're working on. So that way you don't end up with conflicting dependencies that your project might require. Like, for example, now you might be working on one project using Flask as your web framework, and on another project you are using a different version of Flask. So in this project, I'm using Flask 1.0. In an old project, I'm using Flask 0.9. Because there are two different projects they are working on with two different requirements. You don't want, if you are using the default Python installation, you can only have one version of Flask at a particular point in time. But with virtual env, you could install a local Flask version, as in a specific Flask version for a particular project, and another Flask version for another project. So to set up our virtual environment, we use virtual env. In my own case, I had to configure it to a virtual env3 because I have two different virtual Python installation. But in our case, it's going to be virtual env, and I specify the name of our virtual environment. The convention is to use venv. So it creates our Python virtual environment for us. So right now, our virtual environment has successfully been created and it's still being set up. If you weren't using the bash shell, Python 3 actually comes with an inbuilt virtual environment, but it doesn't work well with the bash shell. So we'll just stick with using virtual env in creating our virtual environment. So our virtual environment has successfully been installed. Now the next step is to activate our virtual environment. To activate our virtual environment, just use source venv script activate, and you should see the brackets with the virtual environment successfully set up. Still successfully activated our virtual environment. Now you can see that our virtual environment is, of course, it's not being tracked by Git, but Git knows about it. We don't want to commit our virtual environment to our version control because our code should work independent of the operating system that we're using. And right now, our virtual environment is for Windows. So we want our project to work in such a way in which any system we are using, it shouldn't have to be dependent on a particular operating system for our project can work. Our project is still able to work on another system. So we need to ensure that we add the venv directory to our gitignore file so that our gitignore file does not bother tracking our virtual environment. Okay, so with that, and with our virtual environment activated, let's install our Python framework. The name of the Python framework we'll be using is known as Flask. So to install our Flask dependency, we run pip install Flask. Oh yeah. Wait for it to install all the dependencies. While that is installing, let's delete all this hello.txt since we are not using it in this our project. All right. So these are hello.py. We're going to convert it. It's going to be the entry point to our Flask application. But I'm going to rename this in this case to main.py so that our project looks more serious. All right. So the first thing we need to do in a Flask application is we need to import the Flask application context. And to do that, from now, before we continue, we need to set up our text editor so that it provides autocomplete for us, as in gives us a visual cue of what we are trying to do. Because, like I said, we are learning, so it's going to be good for us if our text editor can provide feedback on some of the things that we're trying to accomplish. And since we're using Visual Studio Code and we have Python installed, we need to come to the extensions tab and we need to find the Python extension by Don Jayamani. In my own case, I already have it installed, but in your case, you will need to install it. So by clicking the Don Jayamani, so installing it will ask to restart your text editor, which you need to do. And with that, we should have Python installed on our. And we need to configure our text editor to be able to detect the Python virtual environment that we're using. And to do that, we use the Ctrl-Shift-P command. Ctrl-Shift-P, and we type Python workspace. And we select the interpreter command. It will automatically detect the virtual environment in our current directory. So you can see the path vim script Python, and I select that. You could choose the Python 3, it really doesn't matter. Both of them are correct. And automatically it creates a .vs code folder with a settings.json file for us. We don't want to commit this .vs code to version control, so we need to add it to our .gitignore file. And with that, autocomplete should be provided for us. So from Flask, import Flask. So right now we're importing the Flask application context, and we need to initialize it. App is equal to Flask fixing a single variable _name. Python has all these variables that have _, they have a special meaning in Python. In this case, this _name represents the current file that we're working with, which in this case is the main.py. So by calling _name, Python knows the file you are trying to reference. And with this, let us create our first view, our first controller. In Python, a controller is also known as a view. That is a function that is responsible for intercepting a request and returning a response. So I'm going to call it def home. Just a simple function in Python, and we're returning a single string, hello world. Now I just created a simple function, but this function is not a view yet, without wrapping it with a Python, with our app.route function. The first parameter is the path. So it means in this case, we are telling Python that when we start our server and we navigate to the home directory, we want the response that comes back to us to be hello world. So this is our simple Flask application. The next step is to actually run this application. Now, to run this application, there are two ways we can run it. The first way, we need to configure something known as an environmental variable that points to our application startup. And to do that, instead of writing, and to do that, we could either do that manually in the command line by running export. The first environmental variable we're configuring is Flask app, and Flask app must point to the file that has our application, which in this case is main.py. So with this now, Flask knows about our application. Then we can now run Flask run, and our application has started up. So if we open our browser and we visit localhost colon 5000, we should get hello world. All right. Now, one disadvantage with doing this, well, it's not so much of a disadvantage, is if we move to a new shell, we'll need to configure our virtual environment, configure the environmental variable, then before we run Flask run. But what will be better is if we created a simple script that automates all those setup for us. And we're going to do that. The name of the script, we're going to call it startup.sh. Since this script is only useful in our system, we don't want to commit it to version control. So we're going to add startup.sh. Also, you can see there was a folder that was automatically created, this PyCatch folder. It is because, and that folder is only created when you're running Python on either a Windows or a Mac system. We also we don't want to commit those particular folders to version control. So we need to add it. And because it can happen in the nested folder, we need to put the star before it. PyCache, that it automatically excludes it. And also, we don't want to add .pyc files. You can see there's a .pyc file at the end inside. So we're going to also exclude .pyc files so that our project, we don't bother adding .pyc files to our project. So the first thing first, the first command is to activate our virtual environment. And how does that work? Source venv script activate. Then the next command is to set up an environmental variable. Export flags app equal to main.py. And with this, instead of remembering to run venv activate and one by one on our terminal, we can just run source startup.sh, and our virtual environment and the environmental variables are set up, and we can now run flags run, and our server starts up, and everything should work as expected, and everything still works. So that is how to create a startup script that helps to make life easy for us. So we successfully created a simple view function. Now, the second way we could have started up our Flask server is by adding a line. If underscore name is equal to underscore main app.run, and we specify the host and the port. But as much as possible, we don't want to use this method. We want to use the environmental variable method. So just thought to mention it. Okay. So right now, we are just outputting stuff, as in we're just outputting a single string. But in a real web application, we're going to actually be making use of an HTML template. So we need to get flags to be able to render HTML templates as an actual HTML template. And to do that, we need to create our HTML template directory in the same directory as the main.py file. And we're going to call it templates. And inside this template, we're going to create a file known as index.html. And in this index.html, I'm going to create the hello world text. To come back to our main.py, we don't want to render this hello world directly. We want it to render the HTML. And to do that, we need to import another function that Flask provides known as render template. So with this, we specify the render template. You can see the first parameter it takes is the name of the template, which in this case is index.html. By default, as long as the name of our template directory is template and it is in the same directory as our main.py, Flask knows where to find the template. And with this, we start our server, Flask run. It should be rendering the template, the content from the template. And to be sure that it's rendering the content from the template, let's be sure, shut down all the servers that are currently live. Okay. So you can see the H1 tag is being recognized by our template. So if I open our template directory, and Control P is to find the file in case you're interested in shortcuts. So I want to render more content. This is my first template in Flask. And if we refresh our page, we should get okay, so right now Flask is not refreshing the page, and that is because Flask is assuming we are running in production. But since we are running in development, we need to add one more environmental variable. So we come to our startup.sh, Control P, startup.sh, and we add another environmental variable, export Flask debug to be equal to 1. And with this, we need to kill our server. We need to kill our server and to run this startup script again. So startup.sh, then Flask to run. Now you can see forcing debug mode to on. So it means right now, anytime we make a change to our file or to our template, the Flask server automatically restarts. So with this, we refresh the page. You can see this is my first template in Flask. If I were to change the content, if I add another content, EM, this is in italics, and I were to refresh the page gets refreshed with the content. All right. So right now we figured out how to make use of an HTML, how to connect our build function to an actual template. But the next question is, how do we send stuff down from the view to the template? So let's say, for instance, now I typed my name and I wanted to get my name, whatever my name is, to render on the template. In Flask, the render template function takes in another parameter, which takes in a dictionary, which takes in as whatever I want to send down. And in this case, we just pass them down. So name is equal to name. So it means whatever the variable I'm using here, if I decide to call this first name, this first name is what will be accessible at the template, while this name is pointing to the actual name variable that exists in this place. So if I come here, instead of hello world now, I need to render my name, I'm going to use hello first name. And with this, if I to refresh the page, I should get hello Abiola. All right. So with this in place, let us now figure out next step is now how to read from query parameters in Python. Now, what do I mean by query parameter? You should have visited websites where, say for example, now if we were to visit google.com and see everything after the question mark, from the question mark, is known as a query parameter. So you can see this GFREID. In case you can't see it, let me zoom my screen out. Okay, the browser does not, the URL does not zoom out. So everything after this GFERG is equal to, and they are all known as query parameter. So assuming I was passing my name as a query parameter now, said first name is equal to Shola. If I went to this URL, and if I went to this URL, and the requirement is to whatever I put as my first name, it should display that particular name here. You can see right now it's still showing Abiola. So the requirement is whatever query parameter we pass through as the first name, it should be printed on the template. And if no query parameter is passed, it should print hello world instead. So what does that mean? It means we need a way to be able to intersect what was actually being passed as the query parameter and to render it down to our template. And in Flask, it is done by importing the request object. So I'm going to put this, and I'm going to import one more variable known as request. And with this, I can pull out. So I'm interested in the first name. I'm creating a variable called first name, and I'm pulling out the query parameter first name by calling request.args.get first name. Now we know that if it exists, this first name parameter whatever was passed as the query parameter for first name. But if it does not exist, we have to check if not first name, then we want first name to be equal to world, because like I said, if it wasn't passed, we want it to be world. And we now send down the content of first name as first name. And with this, if we to go to our browser and we're to refresh this URL, instead of Abiola now, we should be printing Shola. Now there was an error, cannot import name I, and that was in line what? And that was in line 1. You can see it here, line 1. So we'll come back to our code. Where are we running into error? Okay, we shouldn't be running into any error again. And all right, let's refresh our page. Good. Now you can see it's rendering Shola. If I change his name to Jones, it should be rendering Jones. If I change it to an empty string, it should render world. You can see how we're able to pass a query parameter to our Flask app, and now we're able to intercept it and get the response. So that will be all for our lesson today. But before we end, we also need to figure out how to make use of some commands, some few template commands. So say for instance now, we're getting both the first name and the last name, or we're getting another query parameter known as number of times, and we wanted the number of times to be the number of times we end up printing the result of the template and the results of whatever the first one we get in our template. So the name of the variable was number of times. And the condition is if the person puts any value that is less than 1, we're going to just render our first name once in our template. But if the person puts any value that is greater than 1, then we'll render the content of our first name, the number of times that was put. If the person puts a string, we'll assume that the person meant 1. So we've got the number of times. We now have to check if not number of times, that is if the person did not type anything, then number of times should be equal to 1. But also, we've not accounted for the case when the person types a string instead of an integer. So we need to ensure that the person actually puts an integer instead of a string. So we're going to make use of a try statement. And number of times is equal to int number of times. Forget I'm using the same name. Whatever the int value. So if it was a string of 1, I will cast it to an int. It returns 1, and we're reassigning it back to the variable. But if the number was not an integer, then we need to catch the exception. And how do you know the kind of exception we're supposed to catch? Well, we could temporarily pause the application and open a new shell and just type Python. So let us try int hello. Because this is not an integer, you can see the type of error, a true false value error. So we're interested in catching the value error. So anytime it catches a value error, we're setting the number of times to be 1 because the assumption is the person puts a string instead of an integer, and the string was not a number. So now let us read through it again. Number of times is putting the result from number of times. If there was no value passed in number of times, the person did not set it, the default value of number of times is 1. Now to check if number of times was an integer, we're casting it. If it was an integer, it shouldn't give any error. Like for example, if we type int 1, you can see there was no error, it's automatically converted to an integer. But if not, it will raise the value error, and until it raises the value error, we assign it manually as 1. So we will need to send the value number of times. All right, so let me indent my code so that we can see it clearly. All right, so we're now sending the number of times down to the template. So it is from the template now that will determine the number of times we would end up printing the result. And since based on the number of times that was passing, that is the number of times we want to print, we're going to make use of something known as a template tag. So it kind of looks like the for loop in Python, but instead it is wrapped with quotes. So for I in can make use of the range keyword that Python provides, and we're passing in what the number of times that is coming from the view. We print out the hello world and end for. Anytime you open a tag, you end it with end for. And with this, so based on the number of times I was passing, if it was once, this will print once. If it was twice, this will print twice. And with this, let us check if our server is still running. Our server is still running. So if we refresh our page, it should print hello world once. Right now, we're running into an error. It happens sometimes. There's actually no error on our side, but let us just make a change. And let's refresh the site. All right, so you can see we're printing hello world. Now, if I added the second variable, number of times is equal to 3. You can see we printed hello world 3 times. If I type number of times is equal to hello, because it is not an integer, the value exception is going to be raised, and it will automatically assume the value of 1. And if I were to change the name, the number of times to be Shola, and I set the number of times to be 20, to end up printing hello Shola 20 times. And that is where we would stop today. So to find out more about Flask, can always go to the Flask documentation. It's actually quite straightforward. I finish up everything in a day. Everything I just explained is right here. If you want to read more about it, come to the overview. Easy to set up, or you read the documentation to find out more about the internal behavior of Flask. If you want to learn more about tags in the template, you can read about the Jinja 2 documentation. You can see everything we did today: minimal application, debug mode, rendering templates. In case you're interested in learning more about Flask, this is documentation. But if you want us to move along from the class, then that is actually okay. But the point is, there's only so much I can say about the framework that hasn't been mentioned already in the documentation. So irrespective of whatsoever level we are in our learning process, we need to always return to the documentation to find out more about what we're trying to learn. If the documentation does not prove helpful, then we have our very good friend Google, and to a large extent, we just need to tell it what we are trying to do. Since we know that we're working with Flask, and for example, we want to learn about how to use condition in Flask template, just literally type it like that. How to use conditions in Flask template, and it should bring out the Jinja command or the template command. You can see using the if statement in Flask and Jinja code. And that is how we learn. So thank you and see you in the next class.